right, thanks for being here. I was joking in the front earlier that the opportunity cost of coming to this talk is quite high because you're missing out on two very good technical talks next door. It is a 45 minutes to a 50 minutes talk, so I'll give you another 3 minutes to leave if you do want to leave now. No one's even moving. Great, you want to be here. Thank you for coming. So, welcome to Accessible by Default. How to get here, or get to become accessible, and perhaps try to make it last as a part of your workflow. I'm Prae. I have always been, I guess, a UX engineer, if that's the term these days, where you focus just HTML and CSS and dabble with JavaScript just enough to not be insane. I specialize in scalable CSS, semantic HTML for large-scale websites and stuff like that. So today, I'm going to focus on giving you an overview of what's actually required to bake accessibility into your workflow. Let's make sure you're awake today. So hands up if you have heard of web accessibility. Perfect, loving this. Hands up if you think you have implemented an accessible feature. That's quite a few of you, which is great. Hands up if you tried using only keyboard to navigate through the feature that you have built. That's still very good. Hands up if you have had any experience making or consuming an accessibility audit report. It's quite a few hands, which is great. Still a little less, but it's fine. Hands up if you've tried using a desktop screen reader like JAWS, NVDAs, or OSX VoiceOver. Same people. Great, I can see the trend here now. Hands up if you have watched an assistive tech user, be it a screen reader user, a 400% zoom user, a braille display user, a Windows high contrast mode users, or any other like regular access need users use your tool. Cool, there's a list of us. Now for those of us who didn't put up our hands for the last 3 questions, I'm going to ask the same questions again. Like, who here thinks they have truly implemented an accessible feature? Who here knows for sure? Which is great, there's a few more of us. But if you haven't, if you didn't put up your hands with just then, that's what we're here to be. We're like, how do we even get there? I'm loosely aware of accessibility, and I'm interested. I have tested a few things, dabbled in, as some of you has raised your hands, but how do I get my team there and try to do it consistently from now on or from tomorrow on? So yeah, in that case, that's what we're here to do. That's for you. But before we go on, I have a disclaimer that I'm required to make. This is my personal take on creating a more accessibility-minded teams and workflows. It does not represent an organization's view, and again, I'm still new in this journey. I've only started officially on this journey earlier this year, though I have always been interested in accessible HTML, but I haven't started really testing with a screen reader or consuming audit reports and doing all that stuff until earlier this year. So there will be things that I say that, of course, might offend people in the community, because I just don't know the language around how to describe certain types of user yet. I don't know what's polite and what's etiquette in the disabled communities. And so I'm still learning, and if you knew or noticed things that I say, I guess could be improved, please just come back and let me know. I would love some feedback as well. Okay, admin aside now. Let's imagine a hypothetical scenario that you might have actually encountered before. In your team meeting, your product manager come in and said, all right, team, we must make our product accessible within 12 months, starting tomorrow. You looked around the room, and these are kind of the reactions you're seeing. You get people who are confused. Some of them haven't even heard of what web accessibility is. Some of them are just dreading this because they've heard from some of their colleagues from the other company or other teams. They're like, oh man, this is like a lot of work. There was so much involved, so much learning, such tight deadline is just not great. Or you have people like me who was like, oh, Oh dear, I've been waiting for this all my life and it's finally happening. Yes. But everyone, regardless of their reactions, are asking the same thing. They're asking, what have we gotten ourselves into? What does this really mean for the team? What does my team need to learn in order to even achieve this goal of within 12 months we need to be accessible? But before we even go on to how we would do it, let's go into a quick, what is actually web accessibility? I love digitalgov.nz's explanation. They basically said web accessibility is about inclusion. It's about making sure that everyone, including disabled people, and those using assistive technologies, can access information and services online. So what this is saying is that people need to be able to access the web and use it. That's basically that whole sentence in a nutshell. But why is it so important that everyone can even access this information? Because information leads to knowledge. Knowledge empowers people. Users with low literacy or can't read very fluently can still learn something if you use simple language on your tool or on your educational website. What about services? Services enable users to achieve their goals. Imagine users who are mute, who can't speak. They can use an online form to do the stuff that they need to do without hopping on a phone and calling a call center because they just can't speak, providing them with alternative way to access services and information. So how does the web equate to being accessible? Because that could be anything. Doesn't have to be the web. It could be mobile apps. It could be any other tools that are physical spaces that enable accessibility. Why is web even inherently accessible? It's actually, we made it accessible by using our HTML. Because HTML itself was created to be a declarative language by nature. And by being declarative, it makes the barrier of entry or make a starting point for anyone, designer, developer, content writers, anyone who wants to even start giving meaning to their text, an easy way to just mark it up. H1 is heading 1, and therefore that's the most important things on the page. Label things a form, because it's a form. Call things a label because it's a label to an input. It's very declarative. So once you learn the syntax, you can start giving meaning to text content on the web. And that's magical. That's what the web was actually created to do, to give meaning to content of your site. Because HTML is standardized, it is managed by a group of people who make our browsers that we use today, Chrome, Firefox, and there's a whole body of people to discuss what should be standardized, what is the right thing to implement on the web. Because it is standardized and internationally agreed upon, even your smart fridge browser will be able to understand HTML just because of the nature, its declarative nature. They might not know how to render JavaScript or even CSS, but sure knows how to render your HTML text. So web accessibility is actually just for everyone, because that is the purpose of a web. A well-coded product with HTML, good solid CSS, and good solid JavaScript enable users to access these web content. If the website or these web content was coded in a non-standard way, for example, things that are linked, you use a span instead, you hack all sorts of things to make it link to somewhere else. These other tools that are accessing web content doesn't understand what to do with this span. It hits on a tag, it knows, there should be something that I should link to. The interaction, it opens to a new window or opens to a new tab. It has a lot of built-in functionality that comes pre-shipped because it assumed standardization. But as soon as you start using custom content to it, you have to work that much harder to try to even fake being a link, or fake being a button, or fake being able to, being a form. That is a lot of work. And also, because it is being used in a non-standard way, it actually hinders and disabled users who relies on things being standard to even access the web content. Meaningless HTML, hiding content via CSS with no alternatives way to show that content, or creating blocking, rendering JavaScript, making the page load super slowly so that screen readers kind of just skip through without waiting. That is especially disabling to the disabled communities. Now, to be honest, when I first started learning about digital accessibility, I was so scared of calling a group of people disabled people. Because, what if that is offensive? If someone shout on the street, oh, you Asian, go home, that's offensive to me. If I say someone is Maori or Pacifica, is that sometimes offensive to them too? How do I call a group of such diverse people with different needs? But after doing a bit of research, talking to a lot of advocates, reading user stories, watching quite a lot of demos by access needs users using products, I realized, no, in the context of us creating things, referring to them as disabled users is exactly what we should be using. It's actually a part of the social model of disability, where we're saying that things around in the environment is created or designed in a way that disabled people from being independent, from being able to access information, from being able to speak out and interact with the world around them. And so a blind user or person can be disabled from using a site that just isn't well designed for screen readers or doesn't have text content on their graphs images. A wheelchair rider who just had a hip surgery, so he or she will recover, might not be able to go to the supermarket checkout, the self-checkout, because it was so narrow. A person cooking with dirty hands might be disabled from using their recipe software because their fingers are greasy, so they have to stop whatever they're doing to go wash their hands and then go and try to make that touchscreen works again, where perhaps voice dictation or any of the features that allows them to do that might work just as well if you allow that to happen. A person with severe ADHD could be disabled from those fancy marketing websites, or the one with 4 colors and moving animation and rotational things, because they just constantly get distracted by all these bright, vibrant colors and all these moving things on the page. They can't find out what they're really on your website to do if you design it in the way that forgets about them, that disables them from using your tool. And so in all those example usage, yeah, the term disabled is exactly what us creators are doing. It disabled and barred these users from independently accessing and using your tools. By not considering and designing with these users in mind, it's us creators saying, no, the problem was with you users who just, happen to not have an eye or happen to have ADHD. It's a problem with you, so our design's fine. But that sounds horrible, right? That's not a way to provide or create an inclusive world. And it's especially scary to think about how any one of us in this room at any point in time in our lives could become disabled temporarily, situationally, or permanently tomorrow as soon as we leave this room, or even just being in this room now. So how do people with access needs consume the web? They use assistive technologies. There are many, many types of assistive technologies for different types of access needs, and a user could use multiple different tools in order to achieve their goals. So we're all pragmatic users. We all have different needs, and therefore we use different types of methods to access information. An example of an assistive tool is what I'm wearing now, my glasses, and what a lot of us are wearing too. Well, it is one of the oldest and most still commonly used assistive tech that we have in the world today. It is a technology. It took someone discovering how eyes work, how the lens work, and how to create the lens that block screens or anything else. I wear my glasses so that I could recognize someone from across the room and know that I should greet him or her because they're my boss and they might fire me if I don't. Of course, my boss is not that mean, so that's just a bad example. So going with a bit more of a digital side of assistive tech, we have an example of screen magnification functionality. Now, when we think of zooming things in, I guess I usually think that it was just, control plus zoom into a browser and it just scale everything up, and if my site's responsive, it will just scale it up fine. But when I watch users who need these features, I realized when you zoom in that way, things reflow. And so you lose track of where things were. Or if you have multiple columns, where did that column go as I zoomed in? And so these users who need everything to be zoomed in, it's not just the web, it's how they even access their computer that needs to be zoomed in. So they set the whole computer to 200%, 400%, and they keep a mental model of where things are on the page, and they zoom right into the area they want to interact with and only focus on that area. This kind of feature is especially useful for users with low or tunnel vision as well, because when you can only see through this bit here, you don't need to know what else is going on in that other side of the screen. You just want to know that bit over there. And so when you zoom in, you don't need to be looking so close. You can be a bit further away and look at the screen at the size that's suitable for you. So remember the content writing guideline, we always say, I know when you write content and design layout, make sure it doesn't flow longer than 8 to 12 sentences. Yeah, that especially applies to this. If your sentence was 12 to 40 words long, people with tunnel vision would go like this. That's how they scan the page. They're not going to see whatever's important content at the end of your sentence. And so layout design is more important than ever. The next one is the one that I discovered not long ago. It's called the high contrast mode. It's available pre-shipped in your Windows computer. You can also enable it on the Mac, but it's not as extreme. What high contrast mode does, in the sense that you've been watching a lot of white background slides over the past 2 days, and white as a color reflects lots of other colors into your eyes. Where you get that much reflection, that much glare from the light, it actually hurts. To some users, that's glaring. They can barely see the small black text among all the white light that's being reflected at them. So what high contrast mode does is that, okay, you have text, you have background. I'm going to flip it around, make it as dark as possible with highest contrast possible so that you don't have to rely on special glasses or anything else. You could just read the web using the high contrast mode. But the problem for us content creators is if, let's say, my logo was an image in black, in the high contrast mode, that would just disappear. You wouldn't see. So how do you even design for these kind of users? Make sure images have alternatives. Make sure images have good contrast regardless. Or just use text. What's wrong with using text? This one was very exciting to watch. I got to watch a user using this tool. This is called a refreshable braille display. And what it does is that they could connect this device onto their computer, onto their phones, and they use the screen reader software on their device to refresh the braille display for them. So they can just touch the braille display and read what the page and the computer is saying to them. So this is especially important if you can't hear and you can't see. But the magical thing about this tool is that those top button displays that you see, those little mini buttons, they could use combination keys on that device and type out whole sentences in like 5 keystrokes to respond to your question or to interact with the forum. So these tools are great. The last one that I want to show you of interest is voice dictation. You know, Google, like Siri, Alexa, things like that, those are a form of voice dictation. It lets you interact with tools. It lets you ask, like, okay, please show me this, or read that out to me. That's one kind of it. There's also a kind of voice dictation tool that called Dragon Naturally Speaking, or in your Mac computer, it's called voice control. And what it does is, again, it lets you interact with your computer just using voice. So if I can't use my hands and I'm just speaking to the screen, let's say I want to edit this photo, I want to zoom in to the mountain in this photo. I say 8, and it will just zoom into that grid of 8, and then lets me interact with that. It will break the grid down further. There's different ways that these tools use, but most commonly it reads the label on your web page, and if you say shop now, but there's like 400 shop now buttons on your page, it doesn't know which one to select, and therefore it just freezes because, no, but if you say shop banana 1 or something along that line, it lets you speak what you want to do in a clear way and the computer knows what to do, and that relies entirely on how you code your HTML. So those are the example of the assistive tech. But how do these magical tools let users access the web products? We're back to HTML. Again, I'm going to have this on until the end of the talk. Please make sure your HTML is semantically marked up. Read what it's supposed to do. Like how, I know it's hard to read documentation of things, but HTML is declarative. If it's a label, what label? There are clear rules on MDN and a lot of other very free resources that try to explain to you what these labels are used for. Please try to learn more about HTML and use what's on the tin, because by you using it in the way that was designed to do, it enables all of these other tools. So even if you don't know how to use Braille display, you don't want to learn how to use like the 400% zoom and all these other tools, you just want to learn one, by marking up your HTML correctly, you will automatically make your tool work with most of these assistive tech. And that's the magic of HTML. Like, think about what you've coded recently. Most of us are living in this JavaScript to HTML world, coding mostly in JavaScript, and we just output HTML. Most of us are also using pattern libraries or design systems that are built by someone else in our team, and so your React app, for example, would look something like this. Here's a button, color primary, and shop now, and then close button. But when was the last time you had a look at what this output? What if the pattern library you're using is outputting this as a span class button with that style? What if the pattern library you're using end up not being as effective as you think it's going to be? When was the last time you checked this? Did you just disable someone by picking up a tool without checking what the output actually says or does? You might be thinking, okay, I get it. Check your HTML, and what's next? Well, how do you even know that your tool is accessible? I thought, all right, I've tried all these semantic HTML stuff. I've made sure I've checked my output. I've tested on a few things. I think about color contrast and all the basics. Like, what else do I do? Normally, you would say, yeah, you can ask the users you can go and run like a mass usability testing session and find out whether users thinks your site is accessible. But we all know that's expensive. It's costly. And to do an actual user interview and usability research, you need a more focused topic. You want to be focusing on which part of your app is accessible or which one isn't. Not, look at my 400 journeys, can you please test all of them, and how many users is that going to be? So that's going to be a very expensive exercise. So asking users when you're not sure, when you're new on the accessibility journey, might not be the best way to go. But what you could do is you could use the Web Accessibility Content Guideline, or Wickhack. And these are pretty much the huge checklist available by the W3C group that supposedly tells you whether your stuff is accessible. Web Accessibility Guidelines follows the 4 core principles. That's called the POUR principles. Perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Your thing is perceivable if users could perceive it. They could see it or they could hear it as the way you intended it to be displayed. Operable, if it's a button, can I tap to it? What can it, can I navigate through the site easily? Or does it block me somewhere? Is a focus state even appearing? Things like that. Understandable. Yeah, sure, you output the text on the button, but does that button mean anything? if there was two menus and you have two menu buttons next to each other, can the user understand what that second menu button is actually supposed to do? Or what does your text even mean? Is that full of jargon that you expect users to interact with? Is it understandable to the user? Robust, again, going back to HTML. If you code and follow the web standards using proper semantic HTML, then you're protected not against, but your software become resilient, because then any other new assistive tech tool that comes up to let you access the web content will know, well, I expect the standard to be like this, and so my tool is going to expect this HTML here. So if you code it according to the expectation, whatever new tools that come out in the market, they will be able to access your website. And that's how you create a robust content. This Wickhack Guideline also comes in different versions, like Wickhack 2.0, 2.1, 2.2. They also come in different kind of ranking levels, A, AA, AAA. If you're a New Zealand government website, you're required to meet Wickhack 2.1 AA standard. Now, A is like, all right, if you're an access needs user using assistive tech, you could sort of use your site. A was like, okay, most of you should be able to use it. It should be fine. AAA is like, all right, cool. Like, you're an ideal UX experience. You tell me what I need to know, and you really support my use case. So yeah, now that we kind of know about web accessibility, how do we even get started? How do we really make web product accessible long term anyway? I'm going to now ease up on the theory in the lectures, because I feel like that was an important part of the talk, just to give you a grounders. But we're getting practical. When you are trying to get your team to become more accessible, there are 7 things or 7 focus areas that you need to start looking at. I know that's hard to read, but that's okay. I'm going to go over them one by one. First step, buy-in. Accessibility 101 talks are very useful for these kind of things, for getting that buy-in. Things that I spent the past 20 minutes speaking to you about was the kind of things you probably need to start introducing to your stakeholders, to the rest of your teams who haven't heard or is not so familiar with accessibility. Even better, you could start splitting them out into mini sessions, like, here's a theme around users with users with visual disability. You can break them down to like, okay, here's the types of users that are like this, perhaps the kind of tools that they're using or strategies they're using to adopt to the web. And then you can have another theme of like, okay, now we're going to go into the users who can't hear. What are their needs? What type of users are there? Things like that. So you can break them down into like small mini sessions. But the key is to have them with all the relevant people in your team, including your stakeholders, as well as doing it consistently. Keep talking about it. Because no one's ever going to come out of these sessions and go, oh my God, I'm so passionate, I'm so interested. I'm going to go out there today and go save the world and make sure everything is like perfectly accessible. No one ever does that. It's like telling someone, oh, there's inequality in the world, and so it's bad. And they're just going to remember, oh, you're right, that was sad. And then they're going to go and have their coffee. Never going to happen. And so, again, keep harping on about it. Remind people that these things exist and that you should be considering things like that. The next things are user stories. I found these useful because in order to get people to empathize with people with access needs, you need to start telling them more of their stories. So on top of just the basics 101, here's the different types, here's the tools they use. Here's an example of a user who actually needs these tools and what kind of difficulties he or she was experiencing when trying to access a product. WAI, so Y Access Initiative, that's by W3C, have a series of stories like this for different types of users that you can start using. Warning, do not start using them personas because they don't cover all the bases. Please don't make personas. Next, we can have empathy workshop. This is personally my favorite. It's actually, you could do accessibility 101 sessions and user stories sharing all you want, but nothing beats getting a whole bunch of access needs users in a room and your team interacting with them. Or even them showing you, oh, here's 400% Zoom users, here's how I use the web, here's my expectation. nothing beats that, and that's only 1 hour session. It's not even a whole day of workshop or like consistent thing. One interaction most of the time is enough to get people's hearts to buy in to the whole concept. So after these sessions, my advice is to watch out for the teams or people in the team who have starry eyes. Try to get their help early, because in your next phase or the next few phases, you will need more than one person to start speaking about these things. You need to start spreading the education load, because if you're the only one talking about this in your team, you're going to become that person who everyone comes to or everyone avoids relating to this issue. So let's start spreading this out. So in focus number 2, that's an audit. You can have internal and external audit. And most of the time, depends on your use case. When do you use each of them? So if you're a government website or you have some sort of a legal requirement that you must meet, like you must meet Wickhack 2.1 AAA or AA in order to be a part of an agency, then you should look at external audit. Get professional to check your site and tell you exactly what is wrong, just because it's a much faster way and a much more accurate way to check. Because again, the people who want you to meet the criteria are also going to use a third party to audit your site and tell you why you're not meeting the standards. And so best case scenario, get someone to do external audits. There are a lot of agencies in Australia and New Zealand who does it. Go out and search for them. As for internal audits, if this drive for accessibility was coming from an internal side, like it was people like me wanting to do more accessible stuff, then you could audit yourself, or you could practice auditing. Because the problem with Wickhack Guidelines is that they read like a legal jargon. Me, as a second language speaker, struggled to read those sentences. Actually, first language speakers in this room who worked with me also struggled to read those things too. So practice makes perfect. So if you do internal audits, your team's going to get upskilled a lot faster than waiting for someone external to come and tell you what's wrong and explain it to you. So it's up to you what you want to do, but let's choose the tool depending on your needs. So what do you even audit? How do I sort out what do I want to work with? Tips for me is get the highest traffic templates of your site or your app. Look at your core user journeys from your perspective, and look at critical components like critical form, critical submission. Like if your app is full of tables, like get those in. So those are the things that you should prioritize when you're looking at audit. If it's internal audit, it's even more important for you to narrow these down, because you as a developer can't be spending 3 weeks running your whole app through an audit by yourself. At this point, you just want to narrow your focus down just a little bit. But if you do an external audit, they'll probably do all the journeys, but they'll still ask you anyway which one you want to audit. So just beware of that. There are ways to audit. There's automated way, which only covers 30 to 40% of all the use cases. There are tools like Wave, there are tools like Google Lighthouse, which is built into your browser. There's Accessibility Insights, an extension to Chrome, which is also free. There's also my favorite, which is XDevTools. It's a freemium, so there's a free version. If you want to do more advanced filtering and searching and more advice, then you get the paid version. So these are all useful for just anyone that is not even a developer. Like if you want BAs to be on board, you want QAs to be on board, or your designer even, get them to just have, install these plugins and have a run through your site just to see what's being fired up, so that at least they're aware, oh, there's like 5 reds here and 4 yellows somewhere there. I don't know what, but at least it gets the conversation started. They can come to you later and ask you to explain what these means. But the beauty of these automated tools is that it does help you kickstart the process, and it does help you start the conversation without being a developer doing these works. Then this is actually the more important part, the manual audit. There's different types, of course. There's keyboard testing. Tab through everything, make sure it's accessible in the way that you expect it to be. Color contrast testing, again, even your designers, QAs, anyone could do color contrasting. Pick up the color on your page, make sure that the background, the foreground is readable, etc., etc. Screen reader testing, again, I would highlight this a bit later, but it is important if you already know how to do it, to just have a glance through your page and see whether the things that are showing on the screen reader shortcuts are appearing the way you expect them to be appearing. Then you have cognitive testing. This one's a little bit trickier to test if no one in your team have those kind of conditions. Oh, 10,000 steps. Like, how distracting. Yeah, you could also do mobile testing. Basically, our phones, if you're on an iPhone or your Android, it comes pre-shipped with a screen reader. And so if anything, you could test it out. And it's just swipe gestures, swipe right, swipe left to the next item, swipe down, triple tap. By starting to play around with these gestures, I found that I could walk around the street in Wellington and still keep my eyes up and safe on the road while I'm still playing with my phone, listening to whatever it is that it's reading out to me. So it's kind of useful. But yes, those are the things that you need to be doing as a part of the manual test. Now, while going through manual testing, you need to get acquainted with the Wickhack Guideline. Now, if yours is only an internal audit, you could start light. I mean, this tool is called, it's like the LE Projects Checklist. It's very basic. It shows you things like, it gives you like a quick checkbox, like, hey, global code, use the lang, and then it shows you the associated guideline that comes with this. It is by no means the most comprehensive way to check your site. But if you're just starting out, I mean, there's no harm, and it's an internal thing. You don't want to be creating a big fuss about it yet. This is a good guide for you to start going through and think about what accessibility means. But if you need something a bit more hefty than that, then you want to be looking at how it works. You want to be looking at the Wickhack quick reference. Now, this is where I said the legal jargon came in, because this is exactly as the audit requirements professionally would be. Like, okay, non-text content level A, here's what you need to do, here's an example of how to achieve these criteria. They are very hard to read. And so whoever it is who's helping you with the audit, give them time to breathe and perhaps some support and extra coffee. But once you get used to the language, you realize a lot of these are overlapping concepts. Once you name something correctly, it then solves 3 of the other criteria where it kind of says the same thing, but for different types of access needs. So yeah, doing the right thing is hard, but once you do it, it solves all these other problems. Now, after you've done all this audit, all this hard work, could take anywhere between 1 to 2 weeks, right? How do you provide a report? No, it is very tempting to go, here's a spreadsheet, here's a summary of, like, you have 14 fails, 5 critical errors, and 2 passes. Imagine sending that to your PO. Yeah, he or she is not going to react very well. So let's do a debrief. Right? Have a blame list sessions, walk them through what you've done well, what failed, how critical, and why are they critical? What type of access needs require these fails to be fixed? Like, what's stopping them? If the critical fail was the users can't access the filter on your search at all because it's not tabbable, then you can explain, well, people who use only keyboard just cannot access this. They don't know it exists, and therefore they can't use this feature. Explaining it in that way gives a very clear sense to anyone who's not a developer what the problem actually is, and perhaps why or how you might eventually solve it. So yes, it is extremely tempting, right, to just look at the report and go, 1.3.1 info relationship is a fail. And then raise a ticket, and then assign it to a dev who has not been involved with the audit. The problem with that is that using the fails as a requirement or the name of a JIRA ticket is that one criteria means lots of things are contributing to that criteria. There might be lots of things on the page that doesn't have relationship, like a label doesn't have relationship with an input, and then somewhere else there's a menu doesn't have relationship with the icon or things like that. So if you look at the guideline, this is what it actually says. This is, again, a whole bunch of jargon. There are 100 ways to convey meanings between structure, between information. It can be done by design, it can be done by code. If you log your JIRA like this JIRA could be one of those JIRAs that lasts for about 5 sprints, because that could be anything on this page. That is not a reasonable way to create user requirements. The better way to create requirements is to look at user goals. Again, the classic, right? I am a user who use a screen reader needs to access the filter because that's a bad example, but you get the gist. Like, don't explain it as 1.3.1, this breaks and therefore go fix it. Explain it as, well, this part of the page, what's caused problems with this type of user, and write your stories from the user's perspective. Because then it gives people empathy. It gives a team an understanding of what you're trying to solve. Because in theory, with agile software development, you're trying to ship and solve problems as you go, not solving tasks that you do every day as a dev. So don't treat it like a task. Treat it like a legitimate user story. Then we have requirements, right? Because I've just shown you a whole bunch of different assistive text and different style of access, I've just shown you a whole bunch of different assistive text and different types of users who might be using those things. Can I cover all the possible disabilities in the world? No, you can't. So how do you do that? There is this thing called WebAIM. It's a website that's very good, provide you good up-to-date information about US-specific accessibility survey. There isn't a New Zealand-specific one yet, but I'm sure it's coming on the horizon by, I think, Utopia. But what these surveys does is that it shows you, all right, which screen readers are the most used in desktop? What screen readers are the most used on mobile environment? What browser combination with what screen reader is the most popular right now? It helps you start narrowing down your criteria and requirements. Or on the mobile, no one uses Android TalkBack. Everyone seems to be using iOS VoiceOver, and therefore there's no point investing your time right now in making sure your thing works with Android TalkBack. Focus your energies on iOS VoiceOver. You could also check with your local advocates. There's a lot of them, right? The Blind Foundation, there's a lot of MSD departments that also helps with the different types of users and different disabilities. Contact the local advocates and ask, what are you teaching your users to use? Because we want to be able to support that. And that would give you a more solid basis, because you know the newer generation of users that are coming into the market and needing your product, what are they using? What are they being trained to use? So that gives you good guidance as well into what you want to focus your support on. A useful thing is also to list out on your website or your tool to say, like, hey, our product, we've tested with these devices and therefore we know it works. So users can, because the disabled users are so used to things just not working for them, that they don't know whether, well, this work, is it because it's unintentional, or was it that you designed for people like me and make sure that your thing works? And if they knew that, oh, this tool was supposed to work with my use case, then they would actually log a bug. Not, oh, if I log another bug, I have to educate more people to explain my use cases and all these things. So you want to make it accessible for them, invite them to give you feedback. The fourth focus, the screen reader training. Now, my friends, welcome to a whole new world. This requires the whole team to be involved. Your BA needs to understand how to use it. Your QA needs to know how to use it. You as a developer and designer need to know how to use it. Because by knowing to use a basic screen reader, you understand the needs. Like, there exists this thing called the rotor, which lets users skip through your page. What does it look like? What do you need to do in order to make it look usable or sound usable to different users? By you or people in the team knowing how to use screen readers, we can all help each other out. Also, divide and conquer. I'm on a Mac. I use OS X VoiceOver. And I'll learn NVDA a bit, but I won't focus on it. And that would be the way that I run. Then my QA will be on a Windows. Then they can learn NVDA, or they can learn JAWS. We can divide and conquer and share our knowledge later. And that would help you not be the only one who even knows how to use screen reader in the team, because sharing that is very important. You could also, in Focus 5, you need to make sure that you check your design and content. Because if a user cannot see your product, the only thing they want to perceive is your content. What does your text content say? How do you make it useful for different people? And so lots of designers would like, oh, will this restrict my creativity? Would I need to cover all the bases? That's a common misconception that designers would have. But your product designer's job description is usually a product designer or UX designer, not a visual designer. And therefore, their job is to make sure your stuff is accessible to people. Experiences, design experiences, doesn't mean visuals only. It also means making sure your stuff is content first and mobile first. Then of course, you go to testing. Sometimes we ask, our design, like, isn't the design system already accessible? Is my pattern library already there? Like, my team said so. Well, again, let me ask you, when was the last time you checked the output of HTML? And how can you be sure that your Lego pieces that individually is designed to be accessible fits well with how your page is laid out? If your experiences will be from top to bottom, have you arranged those components in a way that is accessible from top to bottom, or from left to right, or from whatever way it is that you want it to be displayed to users? And it's okay. Some developers haven't needed to touch HTML and CSS in forever or throughout their career because they just always use a library. Walk them through it. Give them time to learn it. They will have to learn it, but be forgiving and understand that not everyone starts off from traditional HTML, CSS, and then JavaScript. These days, people are starting from JavaScript, a bit of HTML, and then so be it. When you're testing, again, choose a screen reader of your choice, choose a domain of knowledge of your choice, and then start spinning out the testing. Your QA will become your powerhouse. QAs know how to test 400 devices with different types of like OS, different types of screen, different sizes. They will now need to start learning how to use differing screen readers as well. It's just another thing to add to their toolkit. Everyone in the team can help out, but to finalize and make sure your stuff really works, that's where it starts. And then you verify the fixes, right? You can, now, this is a time where you go, I've done all this work, but this is the bit where we're a bit iffy about making sure it's accessible. Now that's a good time to do usability testing and make sure that you get real users' feedback about your product and how you might elevate the experience. Not whether it's accessible, but to elevate the experience, to say, oh, you're AAA for me. You're a good experience for me. Not, oh, I can barely use your site, but sure. So to sum it all up, your team needs all these buzzy words, attributes. Empathy, you need to be curious, because if you're curious about your access needs users, you'll naturally start searching about, oh, dyslexic users, what are they like, what do they need, or colorblind users, what types are they, how do I support them? As you get more curious about your user, you will naturally start to question how you're doing things. And so make sure that you start thinking about that. And eventually, hopefully, we can be inclusive enough in the way we're building software and hopefully start adopting more inclusive tools that we can also hire people with access needs to be designing with us, designing tools with us, not that we're designing for them. Because the only way to be truly inclusive is to design with access needs users. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. We have time for questions. I still have like 4,000 steps to go, so if we've got questions up the back, you'll be doing me a favor. So I will head up there first. Boom, boom, boom.
Hi, Prae. Great talk. I find when we're thinking about accessibility, we generally tend to focus on those obvious, visible impairments, such as those visually impaired or motor skills. So we focus on screen readers and keyboard navigation. You mentioned ADHD. Do you have any advice on us getting buy-in from product on designing and building systems with neurologically diverse people in mind?
This is something that I'm trying to figure out as well, but what you will find is that a lot of designers in your team probably, like at least I found out that 3 of the designers at my group actually have like differing spectrum of dyslexia. They just happen to hop into design. That's a very common thing. They don't realize, and then they realize, oh, I'm designing for these groups and I'm finding the same problem. So perhaps like even ask your team first, like, if you're in a comfortable space, if you're in a safe environment, that is, perhaps they would want to share some of their conditions. If not, I follow quite a few neurodiverse groups of people on Twitter, and they would tweet about like, here's an example of like how Spotify just doesn't work for me because of this looping animation. So I feel like the next best thing is to listen to those stories and really read through their feeds, because they're very vocal about their needs. There are not many of them, and I could share the list afterwards. Yeah.
sometimes accessibility needs have different things that contrast with each other. For instance, contrast rates, you want to make them much higher for visually impaired, but you also don't want to make them too high, or else people who've had some other issues might find them too jarring. How do you weigh up accessibility needs that are in direct conflict with each other?
This is like, it's something that I'm still working on as well. And unfortunately, I will have to go with the most vocal of these users. When I do my research or when I ask to recruit users, I will try to recruit both from the people who I know would probably have problems with this particular combination, but in the end, we can't please everybody. But what we could do is that we can try to give options. Like if your app by default is this particular color and this particular tone, you could provide differing options in the future to go, well, if you prefer high contrast, you can switch this on, or detect high contrast mode preference, and then show that rather than the default dark mode or default white mode. There's things you could do to help, and a lot of CSS a lot of CSS media queries let you query those kind of selections. I would say do what you can, but make the default a bare minimum accessible criteria. For a better experience, that's where you start adding another layer and additional options, a toggle. Like how you have power users, you can choose to use Control K to search for things in Slack. Those are not browser defaults, but browser defaults would work on Slack because it's built using web technologies. I feel like I would go with that kind of principle.
Just to build on your answer and just to give some more information with the color difference, I know that I think it's the WAG, the guidelines actually give you a number of how different it should be to be in that middle guideline for both people who need it to be X amount contrasty without being too contrasty, so you can actually go and check it out. And I know there are some different applications, so you can put in the 2 different color numbers and you can actually see what guideline you're sitting in and if it is within the preferred values or not.
Cool, thank you. Because I think my past projects always looked at the A and AA guideline, and so they're not quite explicit on like catering for all. They're explicit for making sure it's barely meeting the criteria for everyone. So it's good to know. Thank you.
One last question from here. I just wanted to ask something that has probably a little bit different aspect on accessibility. Some years ago, I saw this talk, and the speaker was deaf, and she shared her experience with some websites that would require your phone number because they would want to call you for something. And then imagine like her experience thinking, okay, why would they ask me for my phone number? It's like completely useless. And then they'll try to call her, and it's a terrible user experience. So are there any resources for people who are designing this kind of the user experience so that they can learn how they can improve the user experience for different users?
So this is where I found Microsoft's inclusive design kit very useful. I should have shown on the slides, but basically it divides users into a spectrum, like temporary, permanent, temporary, sectional, permanent, and then there's another spectrum on different types like visual, hearing, motor, and another one which I don't remember. But basically it shows you a spectrum as to like how, I guess, disabled you can be by different tools. Sometimes I just go, hey, when you're just lost for, like, if you can't, when you're trying to design for so many different types of experiences, perhaps just glance through this spectrum and see like, okay, if I design it this way, would it harm this group of user? Would it harm this group of user? And that's a very high level and more accessible and visual way to kind of think about it. You might not know for sure. The only way to really test is with your users, but with things like that, the designer just needs memories jogged, right? Or the PO and the BA needs their memories jogged that, oh, there exist this type of users who cannot use a phone. Can you please provide other alternatives? And so, yeah, Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit.
Hi, are there any ways through analytics or logs you can get a sense of some of the types of users that you've got? I mean, some users in like ADHD are never going to come up in logs, and some users, if you're excluding them completely, you're never going to see them. But in the same way you can tell, say, mobile versus desktop users, can you see screen readers and that sort of thing?
From what I understand, I'll probably check with the experts in front now, because these two in the front are experts. But from what I understand is that stuff like screen readers controls your whole computer. And if the browser agent like Chrome and Firefox that sends reports to Google Analytics does not know how to recognize what tool is being used on top of it, it would not be able to report it. Because it's not a browser plugin, it's not a browser-specific feature, it's a whole computer of feature. So I would suspect no. And lately, when I want to work out the support and who uses stuff, I have to go by accessibility advocates and the global stats that are being published right now. But no. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, that's my understanding also. There would be ways of detecting whether or not someone has tried to use a feature that would only be for screen reader users, perhaps. Like a skip navigation link is a very popular first link in the page, and there are some ways, of course, you could tie that into an analytics package and track that someone was actually activating that skip link. That can often cause a URL change, and so you may actually be already tracking that if you have skip links in your page.
Phew, okay. I was hoping, actually, if there were more ways to track that, I would love it, but unfortunately not yet.
Time for one more, I believe.
So much time?
I actually have one. So I see large organizations taking accessibility more seriously. Once they get large enough, big enough teams, they have enough users, they start to go, okay, well, a small % of our users need this, and we're willing to do that. Do you think there's a way to get a buy-in in like a small SaaS startup to actually spend the time to make it accessible by default and from the beginning?
So from my biased perspective, I feel like it's much easier to bake that into a small SaaS startup than a large corporate one, because when it comes to small SaaS startup, it only takes 1 or 2 really interested people for things to start spreading within the company. Because of the nature, right, the very agile, fast-moving nature. So the more you talk about it, the same thing, the faster it gets. But when it comes to large corporates, you then need to go through layers, and each different product groups have their own priorities and roadmap for the next year or 2. How do we slot this in, and what are the measurements? You need the requirements to get buy-in for large corporates is way, way more than a SaaS startup.
Thank you very much, Prae. That was wonderful. We are now about to break for afternoon tea, and after afternoon tea at 4 p.m., everyone is back in here.